Hello YouTube, welcome to the third video of my challenge to read the New Testament in the order it was written. I'm reading from the New International Version, but feel free to choose whatever translation you prefer. I just finished the second book, which is 1 Corinthians. It was written by Paul in the year 54, about 24 years after Jesus died, which is about 2 years after his letter to the Thessalonians. The first few chapters of 1 Corinthians seem rather similar to 1 Thessalonians. He talks about how you should be humble and behave yourself so you'll be ready to be judged when Jesus is revealed at the end of the world. But then his tone changes and he starts giving specific commands and instructions. Chapter 5, verse 11. You must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or slanderer, a drunkard or swindler. Do not even eat with such people. That doesn't sound at all like the advice that Jesus would have given. In fact, Paul hasn't quoted from any of Jesus' sermons at this point. But strangely enough, he does quote from the Old Testament 17 times. Here's a list. I think I'll start a scoreboard of how many times Paul quotes Jesus' teachings, how many times he quotes the Old Testament, and how many times he just makes up his own rules. The latter happens 10 times in this book, and a couple of them are real doozies. Here we go. We just talked about number 1, don't associate with immoral believers. Number 2, don't take a believer to court. Settle it within the church. I've heard that Jehovah's Witnesses actually follow this rule even to the extreme of protecting child molesters, but I don't know anyone else who does. Number 3, sexual immorality is worse than other sins. Number 4, divorce is forbidden unless your spouse is a non-believer. You'd think this would be a perfect opportunity for Paul to quote what Jesus said about divorce, but he doesn't do that. Moving on. Number 5. When a pagan offers you food or drink, eat it or don't. This is a weird one. In chapter 8, Paul talks about what to do if a non-believer offers you food that was sacrificed to another god. He says it's okay for you to eat it unless a believer sees you and it causes a problem, in which case you shouldn't have eaten it. Later in chapter 10, he says you shouldn't ask where the food comes from, but if they tell you it was sacrificed to another god, then you should refuse to eat it. So basically, don't ask, don't tell. Number 6. When praying, men can't wear hats, but women must wear hats. Seriously? Number 7. It's a disgrace for men to have long hair or for women to be bald. Well, that sounds like a fashion choice to me. Number 8. Believers should share their food with each other so none of them go hungry. I think this explains why Baptists love potluck dinners. Number 9. Compassion is more important than knowledge or faith. This one comes from chapter 13, the so-called love chapter. We've all heard it 1,000 times. Love is patient, love is kind, etc. But I do want to point out that the Greek word used in the original text is agape, and the King James Version translates this as charity. So the final verse says, now abide faith, hope, and charity, but the greatest of these is charity. In the 21st century, we tend to associate the word charity with giving money to poor people, but in the time of King James, it meant forgiveness or compassion. And now we come to rule number 10. Women aren't allowed to speak in church. Wow. Just wow. So, that's 10 points for Paul, 14 points for the Old Testament, and still no points for Jesus. There is one spot where Paul quotes Jesus, but it's not from any of Jesus' teachings or ministry. It's from the Last Supper. Paul is giving the Corinthians instructions about the right way to do a Lord's Supper, and he quotes, this is my body, which is for you, do this in remembrance of me, and this cup is the covenant of my blood, do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. Right after that is the part where Paul says that all believers should share their food. As I said in my previous video, Paul seems to think that the end of the world will happen any day now, and on that day Jesus will be revealed. In chapter 1, he warns the Corinthians to be ready for it. In chapter 7, he suggests there's no point in getting married because the time is short. It's interesting to see Paul's perspective on who Jesus is. He keeps calling him our Lord Jesus Christ, and Christ means Messiah, or literally anointed one. He mentions several times that Jesus was crucified. He also seems to believe that God and Jesus are not the same person. For example, in chapter 6, verse 14, he says, "By his power God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will raise us also," which isn't the same thing as saying Jesus raised himself from the dead. And he says it again in chapter 15. Also in chapter 11, verse 3, he says, "The head of every man is Christ, and the head of every woman is man, and the head of Christ is God." That doesn't sound like someone who thinks Christ and God are the same. It's interesting to see what Paul says about himself. In chapter 9, Paul gets rather defensive, insisting that he deserves the title of apostle. Then he argues that it's only fair that as an apostle, he should get paid. Then he reverses and says that even though he deserves to be paid, he is proud to say he has never taken money, and he would rather die than give up this one thing he can boast about. In chapter 12, he says different people have different abilities, sounding very inclusive. Then he makes a list of which abilities are better than others. First of all, apostles. Second, prophets. Third, teachers. Then miracles. Then on the bottom level, gifts of healing, helping, guidance, speaking in tongues, and interpreting. Notice he put himself at the top of the list. What a guy. In chapter 15, Paul talks about all the people who saw Jesus after he was resurrected, and concludes with, "And last of all, he appeared to me," following it up with, "For I am the least of the apostles, and I worked harder than all of them." This guy really knows how to humble brag. First he says he's definitely an apostle, and apostles are the most important members of the church. Now he calls himself the least of the apostles, but then says he worked harder than all the other apostles. Paul wraps up the letter in chapter 16, reminding the Corinthians to take up a collection of money and have it ready for his arrival. But remember, he said he'd rather die than keep any money for himself. I wonder what they're going to do with all that money. Then he talks about future visits. He says he might spend the winter in Corinth, and concludes, blah, 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 love and kisses, Paul. That's the end of 1 Corinthians. Next, I'll be reading. I got almost all the way through the video without making a mistake. Next, I'll be reading Romans and Galatians, both written by Paul around the year 55. See you there.